The ritual of kingship began at dawn when the desert was painted gold and red. Temin stood before the assembled tribes. Wearing robes made from the finest cloth, the HFY could find the crown rested on a stone altar surrounded by offerings of water and precious metals. Elder Kira spoke the ancient words that had not been heard for 1,000 years. The first task was to bring water to the Bone Valley, the driest place in all the wasteland where nothing had grown for centuries. The valley was a day march from the gathering place, and legend said that even the old kings had failed to make it bloom. The crown would either prove its power or reveal Tamin as a false prophet. Hundreds of warriors followed him across the burning sand dunes toward the cursed valley. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the air shimmered with heat. The crown glowed steadily in his hands, growing brighter as they approached their destination. The water that flowed from it left a trail of moisture that quickly evaporated in the dry Airbone Valley. Was a horrific sight that lived up to its name. The ground was cracked and white like dried bones, and the air smelled of death and desperation. Scattered across the valley floor were the remains of creatures that had come here seeking water and found only doom. The silence was complete except for the whisper of wind through empty skulls. Tamin walked to the center of the valley and raised the crown. Above his head, the artifact began to pulse with intense blue light, and the symbols on its surface moved faster than ever before. Water began to flow, not just from the crown, but from cracks that appeared in the ground itself. The dry earth drank deeply and began to change where the water touched the ground. Green shoots began to emerge. Plants that had been dormant for centuries awakened and reached toward the sun. The valley floor transformed from bleached bone to living soil in a matter of hours. The watching tribes cried out in amazement as flowers bloomed and small trees began to grow. The second task was to unite the blood feud clans who had been fighting each other for generations. The HFY brought their most bitter enemies to witness the miracle. Two families that had killed each other. Members for decades stood face to face with weapons drawn. The crown would either make peace or be stained with blood. Tamin stood between the angry warriors and spoke about the greater enemy approaching. The Scarthal army would destroy both clans unless they worked together. The crown began to glow, and its light seemed to calm the fierce emotions. The water that flowed from it was offered to both sides as a sign of shared need. The clan leaders drank from the crown, and their eyes met without hatred. For the first time in years, the water seemed to wash away old grievances and replace them with understanding. The warriors lowered their weapons and clasped hands in the ancient gesture of peace. The blood feud was ended by the power of shared hope. The third task was the most dangerous. Tamin had to enter the Cave of Shadows where the spirits of dead kings were said to dwell. Anyone who entered without permission would face death from invisible guardians. The crown would either protect him or he would join the bones that littered the cave floor. The cave entrance was a black hole in the side of a red cliff that seemed to swallow light itself. No living creature had emerged from its depths in living memory. The air that flowed from it was cold and smelled of ancient death. The assembled tribes watched in silence as their chosen king approached the deadly threshold. Inside the cave, the crown light was the only thing that held back the crushing darkness. The walls were covered with paintings that seemed to move in the flickering glow. Faces of ancient kings stared down at him with eyes that seemed alive. The deeper he went, the more the crown pulsed with energy. At the heart of the cave was a pool of perfectly still water that reflected the crown light like a mirror. As Tamin approached, the surface began to ripple and images appeared in the water. He saw the history of the HFY people, their rise and fall, and their hope for redemption. The crown grew warm in his hands as if approving of what he witnessed. The spirits of the dead kings appeared as ghostly figures that surrounded the pool. They spoke in voices like wind through stone, asking if he was ready to accept the burden of leadership. The crown answered for him by filling the pool with fresh water and causing flowers to bloom. Along its edges, the ancient spirits bowed their heads in acceptance. When Tamin emerged from the cave, the waiting tribes erupted in celebration. The three tasks had been completed, and the crown had proven its power beyond doubt. Elder Kira placed the artifact on his head and spoke the words that made him king. The blue light spread outward like a wave, touching every warrior present, but the celebration was cut short by urgent news from the scouts. The Scarthal army had arrived sooner than expected, and was already setting up camp on the northern edge of the wasteland. Their hover tanks and energy weapons were clearly visible in the distance. The time for preparation was over. King Taemin, as he was now called, held his first war council that very night. The tribal leaders gathered around maps, drawn in the sand. While the crown provided light for their planning, the enemy had superior technology. But the Kethvari had intimate knowledge of the desert and the advantage of fighting. For their homeland, chieftain Daeho was the most experienced military leader among the tribes. He had fought the Scarthul before and knew their tactics. The enemy would try to force a quick battle using their technological advantage. The Kethvari would need to use guerrilla warfare and turn the desert itself into a weapon. The crown revealed new abilities as the planning continued. It could locate underground water sources that would be crucial for sustained fighting. It could predict sandstorms that might be used to blind enemy sensors. It could even guide warriors to hidden weapon caches left by the ancient Kingstamen. Shared his knowledge of technology and tactics learned from his Space Corps training. He showed the warriors how to build traps using salvaged materials from his ship. He taught them to use the desert terrain to their advantage and explained how to disrupt enemy communications. The tribes began to work together with an efficiency that surprised everyone. Old rivalries were forgotten as they faced a common threat. Young warriors trained alongside veterans, while elders shared knowledge of secret paths and hidden strongholds. The crown seemed to strengthen these bonds by glowing brighter when the people worked in harmony. Weaponsmiths worked through the night, creating spears and arrows tipped with metal from the crashed ship. Engineers learned to build simple explosives using materials from the cargo hold. The crown water was used to temper metal and create weapons that were stronger than anything the tribes had possessed before. Messages were sent to distant settlements calling all able warriors to join the fight. Some tribes that had never allied with others sent their best fighters in response to the call. The legend of the Waterbringer had spread far beyond the local region, and warriors arrived from across the wasteland. The crown had become more than a symbol. It was a rallying point for an entire civilization. The water it produced was shared among all the tribes, creating bonds that went beyond mere alliance. The artifact seemed to grow more powerful as more people believed in its promise of restoration. As the full moon rose over the desert, the newly crowned king stood before his assembled army. The crown on his head blazed with light that could be seen for miles. The warriors raised their weapons and voiced a war cry that echoed across the wasteland. The Scarthul invasion would meet united resistance. Elder Kira approached him with final words of wisdom. The crown had chosen him, but the real test was yet to come. The enemy had weapons that could destroy mountains, but the Kethvari had something more powerful: the desperate courage of people fighting for their survival. The battle would begin at dawn, and the fate of an entire world hung in the balance. Taemin looked at the crown in his hands and felt the weight of thousands of hopes and dreams. The simple pilot who had crashed in the desert was gone forever, replaced by a king who would lead his people into their greatest challenge. 3 days in the desert had taught Taemin many things about survival. The sand burned his feet during the day and froze them at night. The sun was like a hammer beating down on his head, and the wind carried sand that cut his skin like tiny knives. He had not found any water, and the crown remained as dry as the day. He received it, but Taemin was not ready to die. He had been trained as an engineer in the Korean Space Corps, and his mind was always looking for solutions where others saw only problems. The desert air felt dry, but he knew there was moisture in it somewhere. His crashed ship might be broken, but some parts were still working. On the third morning, he made his way back toward the crash site. The Kethvari warriors were still there, watching from a distance. They seemed surprised to see him walking instead of crawling or lying dead in the sand. Their glowing eyes followed him as he moved through the wreckage of his ship. Taemin found what he was looking for in the cargo hold. The atmospheric processor was damaged but not destroyed. It was designed to clean air and remove moisture for long space flights. If he could repair it, the machine might be able to pull water from the desert air. The parts he needed were scattered, but still usable. Working in the blazing heat was like trying to build something inside an oven. His hands burned when he touched the metal, and sweat dripped into his eyes, making it hard to see. But he kept working because stopping meant dying. The HFY warriors watched him with growing interest as he assembled strange devices from ship parts. The first attempt failed. The machine made noise but produced nothing. The second attempt made a few sparks and then died the third time he tried. A different approach using the ship power core to boost the energy. The machine hummed to life and began to vibrate in a promising way. Tamin held his breath as the processor worked. Its sensors detected moisture in the air and began the extraction. Tiny amounts of water vapor were pulled from the atmosphere and condensed into liquid drops. It was working, but very slowly. Each drop was precious in this deadly place. The first drops fell into the crown and something amazing happened. The metal began to glow with a soft blue light that seemed to come from deep inside. The strange symbols carved into the surface started to move and change like living things. The crown grew warm in his hands, but not hot enough to burn. More drops fell, and the glow got brighter. The water in the crown began to multiply. As if the liquid was growing, the few drops became a small pool, then a larger one. The crown was filling with clear, cold water that tasted better than anything Tamin had ever drunk. The watching HFY warriors fell to their knees in shock and fear. Their leader made sounds that might have been prayers or curses. The crown that had been dry for 1,000 years was now full of life-giving water. Steam rose from the surface, making it look like the human was drinking boiling water. Tamin did not understand what was happening, but he knew it was important. He lifted the crown to his lips and drank deeply. The water was perfect and seemed to give him strength. The crown refilled itself as he drank, as if it had an endless supply. The glow grew brighter with each sip. Word of the miracle spread quickly among the HFY. More warriors arrived from distant places to see the human who had awakened the sleeping crown. They whispered among themselves in their hissing language and pointed at him with something that looked like respect, mixed with fear. An old female creature approached him slowly. She wore more jewelry than the others, and her scales were marked with intricate patterns. Her eyes were the same glowing yellow, but they seemed wiser and more ancient. She spoke in a voice like wind through stone. Ancient prophecy speaks of stranger from burning sky who will wake the sleeping power. Crown of eternal drought has chosen you. Water flows again after 1,000 years of dryness. You are the one foretold in old stories. The old female introduced herself as Elder Kira and explained that she was the spiritual leader of several tribes she had lived for many seasons and remembered stories that others had forgotten. The crown had belonged to the last great king of the HFY people before their world became a wasteland. Long ago, this world was green with rivers and forests, but disaster came from the sky and turned everything to sand. The great king promised to return when his people needed him most. The crown was buried with his promises. The water would flow again when the chosen one Ayurvedic listened to her words and realized he had become part of something much bigger than a simple survival story. The crown was not just a container, it was a symbol of hope for an entire civilization. The water it produced was not just liquid, it was proof that their world could be saved. More tribes arrived each day to see the miracle. The crown continued to produce water for anyone who needed it. Families who had been fighting over drops of moisture now had enough to drink and wash. Warriors who had been enemies began to work together to protect the water bringer. The crown seemed to respond to the emotions of the people around it. When they were happy, it glowed brighter. When they were sad or afraid, the light dimmed, but never went out. Tamin began to understand that the artifact was somehow connected to the collective spirit of the HFY people. Elder Kira taught him about the history of her people and the meaning of the symbols on the crown. Each mark told a story of the old kingdom when water flowed freely and the people prospered. The crown was not just a tool, it was a memory of better times and a promise of future hope. As more tribes learned about the waterbringer, they began to unite in ways that had not happened for centuries. Old feuds were forgotten. As families shared the precious water, enemies became allies in the face of the greater miracle. Young warriors spoke of rebuilding the ancient cities, but with the growing legend came growing dangers. Other species had heard about the human who could make water appear in the sacred crown. The Scarthal Empire had been expanding across this region of space, and they would not ignore such a powerful artifact. Tamin realized that his simple survival had become something much more complicated. He was no longer just a crashed pilot trying to stay alive. He had become a symbol of hope for a dying people and a target for those who would steal that Hope the crown pulsed with energy as if it sensed the coming challenges ahead. The water it produced tasted of promises and possibilities, but also of the responsibility that came with power. Taemin looked at the growing crowd of believers and knew that his real journey was just beginning. Elder Kira placed her clawed hand on his shoulder and spoke words that would change everything. The crown has chosen you, but choosing and accepting are different things. Will you be the king that our people need, or will you try to return to your old life? The question hung in the desert air like the heat itself. Taemin looked at the crown in his hands and felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him. The water continued to flow, and the people continued to hope, but the hardest decisions were still ahead. News of the water miracle spread across the wasteland like wildfire. Every day brought new groups of HFY from distant settlements to witness the human who had awakened their sacred crown. Taemin found himself at the center of a growing movement that he never asked for but could not escape. The crown had become more powerful with each passing day. What started as a few drops of water had grown into a flowing fountain that could fill containers for entire families. The metal artifact pulsed with blue light and seemed to respond to the emotions of those around it. When children laughed near it, the water tasted sweeter. When warriors spoke of battle, it grew warmer. Elder Kira spent long hours teaching Taemin about the ancient history of the HFY people. She showed him cave paintings that depicted their world before the great disaster. Rivers flowed through green valleys and cities rose toward the sky like crystal mountains. The people had been artists and builders who created wonders that lasted for thousands of years. Then came the day when the sky burned and the waters dried up. A massive asteroid had struck their world, changing the climate and destroying the ecosystem. The great cities fell into ruin and the people became nomads, wandering the wasteland in search of precious water. The crown had been their last connection to better times. According to the prophecies, the last king had made a promise. Before he died, he would return in the darkest hour when his people needed him most. The crown would choose a new bearer who would restore the flowing waters and unite the scattered tribes. The signs all pointed to Taemin as this chosen one, but being chosen came with serious responsibilities. Rival tribes sent challenges to test his authority. Some wanted to see if he could make water appear in other containers. Others demanded that he solve ancient disputes between families. The crown always responded to genuine need, but it seemed to judge the intentions of those who approached it. The biggest test came when a group of young warriors challenged his right to carry the crown. They argued that an outsider could not understand the true needs of the HFY people. They demanded single combat to prove his worthiness. According to ancient tradition, Taemin had never been trained for fighting, but he could not refuse without losing the respect of all the tribes. The challenger was a fierce warrior named Junho, who had defeated many enemies and wore their teeth as trophies. His scales bore the scars of countless battles, and his eyes burned with the desire to claim the crown. The combat took place at sunset when the desert was painted red and gold. Hundreds of HFY gathered in a circle to watch the battle that would determine their future. Taemin held the crown in one hand and a simple metal rod from his ship in the other. He had no armor and no experience, but he had something his opponent lacked. During the fight, Junho was faster and stronger, but Taemin used his engineering knowledge to turn the battle into a problem to be solved. He used the terrain and his opponent momentum against him. When the warrior charged, Taemin stepped aside and used leverage to send him tumbling into the sand. The crown glowed brighter during the combat and seemed to guide Taemin's movements. Water began to flow from it, creating a small stream that followed him as he moved. The watching crowd gasped as they saw their sacred artifact actively helping the human warrior. The message was clear: the crown had truly chosen him. After the victory, more tribes pledged their loyalty to the Waterbringer, but success brought new dangers. Scouts reported that the Scarthal Empire had heard about the miraculous crown and was sending an army to capture it. These were not primitive desert dwellers, but organized soldiers with advanced weapons. The Scarthal had been expanding across this region of space for decades. They conquered worlds by destroying local leadership and enslaving the population. They saw the uniting of the HFY tribes as a threat to their plans. The crown would make a valuable prize for their emperor. Elder Kira warned that the coming war would test not just Taemin's fighting ability, but his skill as a leader. The scattered tribes had never fought together as one people. They had different customs and old grudges that made cooperation difficult. Only the promise of flowing water and the legend of the chosen king held them together. Taman realized he needed to learn more than just how to make water appear. He studied the tribal customs and learned to speak their language without the translator. He listened to their stories and began to understand their deepest fears and hopes. The crown seemed to approve of his efforts by growing ever brighter. The artifact revealed new powers as his understanding deepened. When he held it near the ground, it could locate underground water sources. When he raised it toward the sky, it could predict weather patterns. The crown was not just a water maker, it was a tool for survival in the harsh desert environment. Young warriors began to train with weapons made from his crashed ship, while older fighters taught them traditional combat techniques. The tribes shared knowledge and resources in ways that had not happened for generations. The legend of the Waterbringer was transforming them from scattered survivors into a united people, but time was running out. The Scarthal army was approaching, and their aerial scouts had been spotted over the northern dunes. The enemy had hover tanks and energy weapons, while the Kethvari fought with spears and simple projectile weapons. The coming battle would be like ancient warriors facing modern soldier. Stamen stood on a high dune watching the sun set over the gathering army of his adopted people. The crown pulsed with steady light in his hands, and he could feel the hopes and fears of thousands of warriors. The simple pilot who had crashed in the desert was gone, replaced by something he was still learning to become. Elder Kira approached him with a proposition that would change everything. The tribe leaders had met in council and reached a decision. They wanted to perform the ancient ritual of kingship that would formally make him their ruler. The crown would become his permanent responsibility, and he would lead them against the coming invasion. The ritual would take place at the next full moon, when the desert spirits were strongest. According to tradition, the new king would have to prove himself worthy by performing 3 sacred tasks. The first was to bring water to the driest place in the wasteland. The second was to unite enemies in common cause. The third was to face death without fear. Tamin looked at the crown and felt its weight in a new way. It was no longer just a survival tool, but a symbol of everything these people hoped to become. He thought about his old life as a simple cargo pilot and wondered if he would ever see the stars again. But the faces of the warriors who looked to him for leadership made the choice clear. The water continued to flow from the crown as if it sensed his decision. The blue light grew brighter, and the symbols on its surface began to move in patterns that seemed almost like writing. The artifact was preparing for the challenges ahead, and so was the man who carried it. Tomorrow would bring new tests, and the enemy army was getting closer every day. But tonight the desert was full of hope and the sound of united voices singing ancient songs. The legend of the Waterbringer was becoming reality, and there was no turning back from the destiny that called. Taman felt the ship shake under his feet as warning lights flashed red across the control panel. The cargo vessel had been running perfectly for 3 months, but now everything was going wrong at once. The engines made a terrible grinding sound that echoed through the metal walls. His hands moved quickly over the controls, trying to fix whatever was broken, but nothing worked. Ship was falling toward the planet below, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He could see the surface getting closer through the front window. It looked like a giant desert with no cities or green places anywhere. The sand was orange and red like rust, and there were no clouds in the pale yellow sky. Ming grabbed his emergency kit and strapped himself into the crash seat. The ship hit the ground with a sound like thunder, and everything went dark for a moment. When he opened his eyes, there was smoke everywhere and the smell of burning metal. The ship had broken into pieces, and his cargo was scattered across the desert sand. He climbed out through a hole in the side of the ship. His legs were shaky and his head hurt, but he was alive. The desert heat hit him like a wall. It was so hot he could barely breathe. The sun was huge and bright in the sky, and there was no shade anywhere. The sand burned his feet through his boots. Damon looked around at the wreckage of his ship. Boxes of supplies were broken open and scattered everywhere. Some of the metal was still glowing red hot from the crash. He could see his water containers had broken, and the precious liquid was already soaking into the sand. He had maybe 1 bottle left from his emergency kit. That was when he saw them moving across the desert toward him. At first they looked like rocks or strange plants, but as they got closer, he realized they were alive. They were tall and thin with scales that looked like armor. Their skin was green and brown like the desert itself, and they had long arms that ended in sharp claws. The creatures carried spears made of bone and metal. Their eyes glowed yellow in the bright sunlight, and they moved in a way that reminded him of hunting cats. There were maybe 20 of them walking in a circle around the crash site. They made hissing sounds to each other that might have been talking. One of them was bigger than the others and wore what looked like a necklace made of teeth and stones. This one pointed a spear at Taemin and said something in a language that sounded like wind. Blowing through rocks, his translation device was broken in the crash, so he could not understand what they were saying. The big creature walked closer, and Taemin could see it was studying him with intelligent eyes. It poked at the broken ship with its spear and made angry sounds. The other creatures gathered around, and they all seemed upset about something. They kept pointing at a pile of broken crystal that sparkled in the sunlight. Taemin realized his ship had crashed into something important. The crystals looked like they had been arranged in a pattern before his ship destroyed them. There were channels carved in the rock around the crystals, and he could see watermarks in the sand. This had been some kind of fountain or, well, the creatures were getting more angry as they looked at the broken crystals. One of them picked up a piece and held it up to the sun. It was clear and beautiful, but now it was cracked and useless. They made sad sounds and touched the broken pieces gently, like they were mourning something precious. The big creature that seemed to be their leader stepped closer to Taemin and spoke in a deep voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. His translation device made static noises and then suddenly started working again. The words came out broken, but he could understand some of them. Sacred water place, broken human thing, destroyed blessing of ancestors. Now must pay for breaking holy place, trial of thirst in deep desert. Taemin tried to explain that it was an accident. His ship had engine problems, and he could not control where it landed, but the creatures did not seem to care about his reasons. They kept pointing at the broken crystals and making angry sounds. The leader called him something that the translator said meant water thief. More creatures arrived from other directions until there were maybe 50 of them surrounding him. They all carried weapons and wore jewelry made of bones and stones. Some of them had painted designs on their scales that looked like lightning or fire. Their eyes all glowed with the same yellow light. The leader creature spoke to the others in their hissing language, and they all made sounds that might have been agreement. Then he turned back to Taemin and explained what would happen. The translator was working better now, and the words came through clearly. You destroyed sacred water place of Kethvari people. Water is life in desert. You took life from many families. Now you must face trial. Take only one container. Walk into deep desert. If you survive 7 days, you may return. If you die, the desert will judge you. Taemin looked at his broken ship and the scattered supplies. He had no choice but to accept their judgment. He was one human against 50 armed creatures, and he had no weapons. The desert stretched in all directions with no sign of shelter or water anywhere. The leader creature walked to the broken crystals and picked up something from the wreckage. It was a metal object that looked like a crown or helmet. It was made of some kind of dark metal and had strange symbols carved all over it. The creature held it carefully, like it was very precious. This is crown of eternal drought, sacred relic of our ancestors. It has never held water in 1,000 years. You will carry this as your container. When you die, it will return to us. You will know shame of trying to fill what cannot be filled. The creature placed the crown in Taemin's hands, and he was surprised by how heavy it was. The metal was warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate slightly, like it was alive. The symbols carved into it looked like they were moving in the bright sunlight. He could not read them, but they seemed important. Other creatures gathered his scattered supplies and took anything useful. They left him with only the crown and the clothes on his back. The leader pointed toward the deepest part of the desert, where the sand dunes looked like frozen waves. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Walk that way until you find water, or water finds you. If crown holds water, you are blessed. If not, you die. Like all who break sacred places, desert will decide if you deserve to live. Taemin looked at the crown in his hands and then at the endless desert ahead of him. He had survived the crash, but now he faced something much worse. The creatures watched him with their glowing eyes as he started walking toward the dunes. His feet sank deep into the Soft sand, and every step was hard work behind him. He could hear the creatures making their hissing sounds as they examined his broken ship. The sacred water place was destroyed, and now they expected him to die in the desert as punishment. He looked back once and saw them standing like statues in the heat. The crown felt heavier with each step, and the desert seemed to go on forever. Sun was setting, and the sky was turning red and orange like fire. Soon it would be dark, and the desert would become cold. He had no shelter and no water except what he might find in the crown that had never held water in 1,000 years. His survival depended on his ability to do something that had never been done before. The Scarthol invasion force arrived like a metal storm across the desert. Their hover tanks carved deep tracks through the sand, while aerial fighters screamed overhead, dropping bombs unsuspected. Kethari positions, the sky filled with smoke, and the ground shook with explosions that could be felt for miles in every direction. General Zekmor led the invasion from his command vehicle. A massive war machine, bristling with weapons and sensors, he had conquered dozens of worlds for the Scarthol Empire and expected this desert planet to fall within days. The reports of a human leading the natives seemed like a joke to him, but the first day of battle proved that the Kethvari were not helpless victims. The desert itself became their ally. As warriors disappeared into hidden tunnels and emerged behind enemy lines to strike with spears and explosives, sand-filled trenches collapsed under the weight of hover tanks, trapping them for concentrated attacks. King Taemin wore the crown into battle, and its power seemed to flow through every warrior who fought beside him. Those who drank from its water found their strength doubled and their wounds healing faster than normal. The artifact blazed with blue light that could be seen across the battlefield, inspiring courage in desperate moments. The crown revealed new abilities during the fighting. It could predict enemy movements, allowing ambush to be set up in perfect positions. It could locate weak points in Scarthol armor, guiding arrows and spears to their targets. It could even influence the weather, creating dust storms that blinded enemy sensors. Chieftain Deho proved to be a brilliant tactical commander who used every advantage the desert provided. His warriors moved like shadows across the sand dunes, striking hard and fast before disappearing into hidden caves. The enemy technology was impressive but useless against opponents who knew every rock and canyon. The Scarthol responded with orbital bombardment that turned sections of desert into glass craters. Their plasma cannons could level mountains, and their energy shields deflected most primitive weapons. The battle became a test of endurance as the technologically superior army slowly pushed deeper into Kethvari territory. On the third day of fighting, the crown began to change in ways that surprised everyone. The water it produced became luminous and seemed to carry healing properties that went beyond normal medicine. Warriors who were near death recovered completely after drinking from it. The artifact was drawing power from the collective will of the people. Elder Kira explained that the crown was responding to the unity of the tribes in a way that had not happened since the ancient kings. The artifact was not just a tool but a living symbol of the Kethvari spirit. The more the people believed in their cause, the more powerful it became. The turning point came when General Zekmor made a crucial mistake in his arrogance. He ordered a direct assault on the sacred oasis where the crown was kept during the battle planning sessions. The site was heavily defended, but he believed his superior firepower would overwhelm any resistance. The attack began at dawn with a massive artillery barrage that shook the earth and filled the air with smoke and dust. Hover tanks advanced in formation while fighter aircraft provided cover from above. The Scarthol seemed unstoppable as they pushed toward the heart of Kethvari resistance, but King Taemin had anticipated this assault and prepared a trap that would use the enemy confidence against them. The oasis was surrounded by hidden tunnels filled with explosives made from his crashed ship. The crown had guided the placement of every charge for maximum effect. As the Scarthol forces entered the killing zone, the desert erupted in a chain of explosions that destroyed dozens of vehicles and scattered the attacking formation. The surviving tanks found themselves trapped in a maze of sand-filled trenches, while warriors emerged from concealment to attack with devastating effectiveness. General Zekmor himself led the final assault on the oasis, determined to capture the crown and end the rebellion. His personal war machine was heavily armored and armed with the latest weapons. The battle became a duel between advanced technology and the mysterious power of the ancient. Artifact King Taemin faced the enemy general in single combat while the crown blazed with light. That seemed to come from the heart of the desert itself. The artifact had become more than a tool. It was a conduit for the hopes and dreams of an entire people. The water that flowed from it created a shimmering barrier that deflected energy weapons. The duel was fierce and brutal, with neither opponent giving ground. Zekmor was larger and stronger with centuries of combat experience. Behind him, his weapons could punch through armor and his shields could deflect most attacks, but Taemin had something the alien warrior could not understand. The crown responded to his desperation by unleashing power that had been dormant for millennia. Water erupted from the ground in massive spouts that sent enemy vehicles flying through the air. The desert itself seemed to come alive in defense of its chosen king. The final moment came when Taemin used the crown as a weapon, channeling its power to create a water tornado that lifted General Zekmor into the air and sent him crashing into a distant dune. The sight of their leader defeated broke the morale of the Scarthal army, and the survivors began to retreat. The victory celebration was brief because the cost had been terrible. Many brave warriors had died defending their homeland, and the desert was scarred by the weapons of war, but the crown had proven its power beyond doubt, and the unity of the tribes had been forged in battle. The retreating Scarthal forces were harassed by Kethvari raiders who struck from hidden positions and disappeared into the vast desert. The enemy had learned that conquering this world would be far more difficult than expected. The legend of the Waterbringer had become a reality that could not be ignored. As the sun set over the battlefield, King Taemin stood, surrounded by his surviving warriors. The crown on his head pulsed with steady light, and the water it produced was shared among all who had fought for freedom. The simple pilot who had crashed in the desert had become a true king through fire and Blood Elder Kira approached with news that would change everything. The crown had revealed the location of other ancient artifacts hidden across the wasteland. The victory was just the beginning of a larger transformation that would restore the Kethavari people to their former glory. The battle for the crown was over, but the war for the future of the desert world had just begun. The water continued to flow, and the people continued to hope. The king who had boiled water in a sacred crown had proven that even the impossible could become reality through courage and determination. In the distance, the lights of retreating Scarthal ships could be seen leaving the atmosphere. The invasion had failed, but the enemy would return with greater force. The crown blazed with blue light as if accepting the challenge of the battles yet to come. 6 months after the great battle, King Taemin stood on the balcony of his palace, built from the ruins of an ancient Kethvari city. The crown had revealed the location of this place, buried beneath centuries of sand and wind. The restoration work continued day and night as his people rebuilt their civilization from the ground up. The wasteland was wasteland. No more green plants grew in valleys that had been barren for 1,000 years. Rivers flowed where there had been only dust and new cities rose from the ruins of the old. The crown had unlocked secrets that transformed the desert into a garden, but success brought new challenges that tested his leadership in different ways. Trade delegations arrived from across the galaxy, offering alliances and technology in exchange for access to the crown power. Some came with honest intentions, while others schemed to steal the artifact or manipulate its bearer. The Korean Space Corps had sent a rescue mission when they learned of his survival. Captain Sujin led a team of engineers and diplomats who offered him a full pardon and promotion to return to his old life. The sight of other humans was strange after months among the Kethvari, but he felt no desire to leave. His place was here with the people who had made him their king. The crown had become part of him, and he had become part of it. The artifact pulse matched his heartbeat, and its water flowed in response to his emotions. The bond between them was stronger than anything he had known. The greatest test of his rule came from within his own people. Some young warriors, drunk on victory, wanted to use the crown power to conquer other worlds and spread Kethvari influence across the galaxy. They argued that their enemies would return stronger unless struck first. Taemin had to teach them that true strength came from building rather than destroying. The crown seemed to agree, as it refused to produce water for those who spoke of conquest. The artifact had chosen him. To restore, not to dominate, and he would not betray that trust. Elder Kira had grown old and frail, but her wisdom was still sharp as a blade. She warned him that power without purpose was the path to corruption. The crown had elevated him above other beings, but it had also made him responsible for their well-being. The weight of leadership was heavier than any physical burden. The crown revealed more secrets as the restoration continued. Hidden chambers beneath the palace contained ancient technology that could purify water on a massive scale. The artifact was not just a symbol, but a key that unlocked the achievements of a lost civilization. Scientists from across the galaxy came to study the crown and its impossible properties. Some believed it was advanced technology that responded to biological markers, while others insisted it was a divine artifact that chose its bearer. The truth seemed to be somewhere between both explanations. Dr. Minjae, a Korean xenobiologist who had arrived with the rescue mission, became fascinated by the crown connection to the HFY people. She theorized that the artifact was a symbiotic organism that had evolved alongside the native species. The water it produced contained microscopic elements that enhanced the natural abilities of those who drank it. The crown had indeed changed the people who followed him. Warriors were stronger and faster than before, while elders lived longer and remained sharp in their thinking. Children who grew up drinking the crown water showed abilities that seemed almost supernatural. The artifact was creating a new generation of enhanced beings, but enhancement came with responsibility. The young HFY had to learn to control their new abilities and use them for the good of all. The crown would not support those who used its gifts for selfish purposes. Several warriors who tried to abuse their enhanced strength found their abilities fading away. The most surprising discovery came when the crown revealed a hidden chamber deep beneath the palace. Inside was a vast library carved into living rock that contained the complete history of the HFY people. The records showed that they had once been space travelers who had colonized many worlds. Their civilization had been destroyed not by a natural disaster, but by the same Scarthol Empire that had recently attacked. The ancient kings had hidden their greatest treasures and knowledge before falling to the invaders. The crown was the key to restoring everything that had been lost. This knowledge changed everything. The HFY were not primitive desert dwellers, but the descendants of an advanced civilization that had been forced to forget their heritage. The crown had been waiting for someone who could help them reclaim their true potential. Messages began arriving from other worlds where HFY colonies had survived in secret. The crown power was awakening dormant abilities across the galaxy, and long-lost relatives were making contact after centuries of separation. The restoration was becoming a renaissance that spanned multiple star systems. The Scarthol Empire had taken notice of these developments and was preparing a massive invasion force to crush the growing rebellion. The crown had made King Taemin a target of galactic importance, and armies were marching toward his world, but he was no longer the crashed pilot who had boiled water in a sacred crown. The artifact had transformed him into something greater. While keeping his essential humanity intact, he had the wisdom to unite people and the strength to defend them. The crown had chosen well. Standing on his balcony as the sun set over the transformed landscape, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. The Wasteland had become a garden, and its people had become a force that would reshape the galaxy. The crown pulsed with steady light, as if approving of his thoughts. In the distance, construction crews worked on new cities, while farmers tended growing crops. Spaceports were being built to handle the increasing trade and diplomatic traffic. The HFY were taking their place among the galactic community as equals, not as subjects. The crown had taught him that true kingship was not about ruling others, but about serving them. It was about making the hard choices that others could not make and bearing the burden of responsibility with grace. The water it produced was a symbol of life and hope that flowed freely to all who needed it. General Unesio approached with the daily reports from across the kingdom. The restoration was proceeding ahead of schedule, and the people were happier than they had been in living memory. The crown had brought not just water, but purpose to a civilization that had almost forgotten how to hope. As the stars appeared in the desert sky, King Taemin felt the weight of the crown on his head, but also the warmth of its acceptance. The simple act of boiling water had become a legend. That would inspire future generations. The wasteland was no longer wasted, and its king would guard its prosperity with his life. The crown glowed softly in the darkness, like a beacon of hope that could be seen from orbit ships arriving from distant worlds would know they were approaching a place where mere